Whether it's for some lush forest bases and scenery, or maybe something more chaosy and rotten, I think that little mushrooms can be the perfect addition to your miniatures. And I want to show you some really fun and easy ways on how to make them. I'm going to start by making some mushroom caps out of Milliput. This is a pretty standard two-part epoxy. Mine is pretty old and weird looking, but it shouldn't matter too much for this application. I'm just going to take equal size pieces of each part and knead it together until it's thoroughly mixed. Once mixed, I'm then just going to start breaking off little pieces, rolling them into balls, and then pressing them down on a parchment paper. You can wet your fingers if it's getting sticky, but I'm just going to make a variety of sizes, rolling my finger around the edges as I press down to sort of crimp those down and create that dome-shaped mushroom cap. This is probably going to leave little fingerprints all over the mushroom caps, but luckily we can just take a brush with just water in it, run it over the tops, smoothing out the worst of those fingerprint impressions. This isn't going to get everything, but anything that we don't get here, we can always just sand off later once they dry. Once dry, you can see how there's sort of some leftover pieces from my older Milliput, but that's okay because mushrooms have scales on them anyway. We're going to complete the rest of the mushroom by first just making a little pilot hole with our X-Acto knife, giving it a small twist. We don't need anything major here, just sort of creating a little impression that we're then going to use a gel super glue and attach a bit of wire to. In this situation, I'm using 18 gauge aluminum wire just because I think it's a nice thinness and then also pretty flexible. Then I'm just going to chop it off, and there you have it. Cute little mushroom. Then all that's left to do is make a variety of sizes. Where the gel superglue collects sort of creates a little glob, and I like it since it sort of looks like mushroom gills, but you can always just scrape it away with your X-Acto knife. For something even easier and that dries even quicker than Milliput, I'm going to be using hot glue. This is easy to just squeeze out little droplets, overall going really slowly as I don't want it to spread out too much, so it keeps that overall dome shape of the mushroom caps. And it's really easy to just play around with this, creating different sizes and shapes with hot glue. And if you found that using wire for the mushroom stems is a bit too limited and uniform, the cool thing that you can do is, as the hot glue cools down after you unplug it, just start extruding more hot glue, going really slowly and pulling the hot glue gun away from the parchment paper. And as it cools, it will hold its shape much easier and create some really cool different mushroom stems. And this is something that you can really easily play around with and experiment to get all sorts of really weird and fun shapes that are perfect for mushroom stems. As we begin to assemble these, much like the others, the pieces are really small and finicky, so if you're having trouble, you can always just mount them to a bit of tape to make things a little easier and more manageable. But much like the others, I just add a blob of gel super glue and then add my wire into the pilot hole. Hot glue is really easy to use, but the only thing is that you get these little stringy bits. Most of them can just get pulled away, but for the really obvious ones, I just remove a bulk of it with my clippers and then actually use a lighter, just dipping the flame onto the hot glue to really round out that surface. The only thing is that prolonged exposure to this creates a really bulbous look, so just be careful and go slowly. The hot glue mushroom stems just need to be clipped down to create a flat surface to attach to the mushroom caps. If you have a hot glue mushroom cap that you want to use the lighter trick on, just make sure that you mount it to something else before attaching it to a hot glue stem. I just mount it to my X-Acto blade so I don't have to worry about melting the stem. As it comes time to assemble these onto the bases, a little rule of thumb is to use odd numbers, as groups of like 3 or 5 just look a little bit more natural and organic. Also clip away the bottom of the hot glue stems to get a flush fit. The ones that are hot glue, super glue on easy enough, but I found that the ones that have a wire stem are a bit trickier to set in place, and a little bit of baking soda actually helps out a ton. This speeds up the drying time, and you can just knock away the leftover once the glue is set. Once assembled, I just smear on some texture paste, trying to get it all over, but also focusing on the middle around the mushroom cluster, as if they're sort of emerging from the dirt. And then using some 600 grit sandpaper, I just polish off the remainder fingerprints, and these guys are ready for some primer and paint. After a black prime, I start off with burnt umber as a base coat. Getting an even layer of this all over and making sure it gets into like all the nooks and crannies, as this is just sort of going to be the base color for everything else. After this, I take a little bit of yellow and red and white and mix it into the burnt umber, creating a highlight color that still reads as dirt, and dry brush this all over the base, picking out some of that texture. I like this because it still has a lot of color to it, whereas adding just white to the burnt umber created a really neutral brown, which was actually perfect as a base coat for the mushrooms. I sort of just slathered this all over them, not being super precious, instead just using a bit of stippling and splotchy painting to give all of the stems and then most of the mushroom caps a layer of paint. You can see on some of them I chose to leave the mushroom caps as burnt umber. I think this just helps to create a bit of variety amongst the mushrooms I was making. It makes them read as like a separate species, but it just depends on what you want to do. I then go ahead and add more white to my mix to create layers of highlights, and again just being really painterly with this application, splotching it on and using stippling to create a natural and painterly look with lots of texture that still reads as something nice and organic. To create some nice colorful variety amongst my mushrooms, I'm also using red and yellow on some of them, just stippling it on to help build up color, and using subsequent layers to help build up the opacity and concentration of that color. Focusing more on the tops to sort of create a natural highlight. To create this cool pattern on the yellow ones, I just mix yellow and red to create orange, and then slowly start introducing burnt umber to it, using really watered down versions of these colors, and just using a bit of stippling to create little splotches, focusing the darker colors towards the center. Once I had a look that I liked there, I then added white to that original orange mix, and just sort of added some faint highlights around the edges and also some really tiny dots. I also carried this dot motif over to the red mushrooms by just creating a really bright version of that burnt umber and white color, and using a brush with an actual sharp tip this time, creating really tiny dots along the mushroom caps. I also went ahead and added like a darker burnt umber color under some of the dots to create shadow, making them look like mushroom scales, but overall I think this probably was a little too much for something that's just like a quick terrain project, but it did enhance the look quite a bit. And then as like a final finishing touch, I took some sap green, really watered it down, and began applying it to the base to help create a mossy look. I then came in with just water on my brush to help break up the paint and make sure it's really getting down into all those nooks and crannies. And I think this was really easy and simple, but created a really nice mossy look, which is also nice because I think that really complements the mushrooms and the sort of environment that they would be growing in. Overall, I think this was a super fun project and a really easy way to make some little mushrooms that are perfect for bases or terrain, suitable for Warhammer, Dungeons and Dragons, or whatever tabletop game you like playing. Or maybe even some really wacky tokens and counters for Magic the Gathering. Thanks for watching.